Well, Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. And thank you for coming out on this rainy evening. I'm Josette Sharon. I'm President and CEO here at Asia Society. We're delighted tonight to welcome back to our stage one of our dear friends at Asia Society, one of the sharpest minds from Southeast Asia, and in fact, one of the sharpest minds anywhere in the world, really, Kishore Mahbubani. Wonderful to have you, and I think your daughter Shayla is here. Yes, hi. You know, thought leader is probably an overused term. It could have been invented for Kishore. He's always thoughtful, always insightful, and thought leader in the sense that he often thinks and says things before others do. Kishore's written many books, and they're all available here, but also in our bookstore, and even before this evening. But this year he wrote the book that I always hoped would be written. It's called The ASEAN Miracle, A Catalyst for Peace. And I always taught my children two things, that two great sources of peace in the world were the European Union, since our family comes from a village right on the border between France and Germany that was always at war, and also ASEAN. And so if we didn't have ASEAN, it would have to be invented, but it would be impossible to do what was done with ASEAN today. I think you'll agree. So tonight we'll hear about the topic of this book, about ASEAN, its important role in Asia. I first met Kishore when he was ambassador to the United States for, I think, 2 terms, and also served throughout Asia as ambassador and also at the United Nations. He continues to have a distinguished career and has served as Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, as well as professor in the practice of public policy. Some of his other books, such as Can Asians Think? And Beyond the Age of Innocence, Rebuilding Trust Between America and the World, are more relevant today than even when you wrote them. Not surprisingly, you've been widely recognized and honored for your work, including the Public Administration Medal from the Singapore government, the Foreign Policy Association Medal here in New York, and we have the head of the Foreign Policy Association with us here tonight. And that honor came with these words in the citation: a gifted diplomat, a student of history and philosophy, a provocative writer, and an intuitive thinker. Tonight, Kishore will give some opening remarks, and then he'll be joined in conversation with another great individual and great thinker and great diplomat, Danny Russel. He's our diplomat in residence here at the Asia Society, and before that was the top East Asia diplomat for the State Department and also for the White House under President Obama. When I worked at State, Danny's a legend, so we're really happy to have you here. Also, conducting this interview tonight. We're going to be live webcast, and so any of you tweeting can do so under Asia Society Live. I just want to mention a couple of other events that we have coming up. First, our galleries have a very relevant show to the topic tonight. It's called After Darkness, Southeast Asian Art in the Wake of History. And this really asks the question, do artists create history or does history create art? And it's looking at really troubled times in Indonesia, Vietnam, and in Myanmar, and the art that rose out of that era and the way that those changes in society were expressed through art. It's a really moving and provocative show. Great review in the New York Times about that. So if you get a chance, come back for that. Next Monday night, we'll have a special event here. You may not know the name Ri Jong-ho, but you will be likely to be interested to hear his story and his views. He's a high-ranking defector from North Korea who held senior posts in economic development in the country and was awarded the country's highest civilian honor before defecting, and he's agreed to come speak publicly here, and that's on Monday. And then for something very different, we're going to have our third annual Asia Game Changers Award dinner on November 1. And that's our new way of recognizing those people who are changing the world for the better in Asia. 10 people are selected every year. This year, through a polling of all of our network throughout Asia and the United States and Europe. And this year, the Aga Khan will be recognized, the founder of Didi, the Uber of China, Jean Liu, and one of the top businesswomen in the world now, an Afghanistan rap singer, and also the great actor and advocate Dev Patel, and others. So we're going to have a public program for the first time with all of these stars who will be here on November 1st in the auditorium in the afternoon. And the dinner, we had to move to a new venue. It sold out in 1 week in August. So we have a handful of tickets left for the night, which is like our own Academy Awards for the people from Asia who are helping build a better world. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Kishore for you to come up and say a few words, and then Danny will join you here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josette. Those remarks were far too generous. I just want to say that I'm very, very happy to be back here. The Asia Society feels like home. You know, I lived in New York altogether, as Josette said, about over 10 and a half years, and I used to come here regularly. I don't know how many talks I've sat in as a member of the audience and how many times I've been on the stage here. So it's really wonderful to see so many old friends here. And I'm glad you made it, Paul. So anyway, so what I propose to do is I've been told to speak for about 10 minutes or so, and I'll keep to the time, and then I'll have this wonderful dialogue with Danny. Thank you very much, Danny, for doing this. So I'm going to make basically 3 quick points in 10 minutes. And they're sort of related. The first point, which is a very important point, which is going to shock all of you, is that we live in a good news world. So I'll explain that. And the second point is that ASEAN is very much part of the good news story. And thirdly, I'm going to say that America has a remarkable opportunity to preserve significant reservoirs of goodwill in Southeast Asia. Don't lose this opportunity. And that's actually one key reason why I produced this book at this point in time. So let me begin at the beginning. Why is this a good news? Well, I have to emphasize that, the news is all bad, right? You wake up, you open the papers, some conflict somewhere, some trouble somewhere, and you sort of feel that the world is going backwards at a rapid pace. Actually, the past 30 years have been the best 30 years for humanity. Actually, I documented all this in an essay that I co-authored with Larry Summers in Foreign Affairs called The Fusion of Civilization. So if you go for all the critical indicators, infant mortality falling rapidly, life expectancy growing steadily, and global poverty, we've been trying to eliminate it. We're succeeding dramatically. And one of the most stunning statistics of all, if you look at the global middle class population, used to be 1.8 billion in 2010, 7 years ago, will be 3.2 billion by 2020, and 4.9 billion by 2030. More than half the world's population is going to enjoy middle-class living standards in our lifetime. That's the best human condition ever. And here we are looking so sad and despondent. Something is wrong with us. So I have to emphasize that the rest of the world is moving ahead so well. And as part of that great wave, of course, is Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And the key thing to remember about ASEAN just celebrated its 50th anniversary on August 8th this year. But on August 8th, 1967, when ASEAN was formed, everybody believed it was going to fail, including those who signed the ASEAN Declaration, by the way. You had, why? Why was it going to fail? Because Southeast Asia was a hotbed of conflict. You think the Middle East is having problems now? Remember how many more bombs were falling in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia. The 5 states that signed the ASEAN Declaration were supposed to be dominoes waiting to fall. And those 5 who came together to sign the ASEAN Declaration had distrusted each other massively. Malaysia and Singapore just had a painful divorce. Malaysia and Indonesia just had confrontasi. Thailand was worried about Malaysia supporting separatists. Philippines was claiming a state in Malaysia. Everybody had problems with each other. That was a union designed to fail. And if you did a mental tour of planet Earth, and you went to Latin America, to Africa, to Europe, anywhere, and you wanted to pick the most difficult region in the world to start regional cooperation, it's by definition Southeast Asia. Why? Today, out of 600 million people in Southeast Asia, you have 240 million Muslims, 110 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and we have a good sprinkling of communists too. And among this most diverse section of humanity, you have the second most successful regional organization in the world. It's a miracle. Now I have to emphasize one thing. The reason why ASEAN succeeds is because ASEAN is hugely imperfect. Its imperfection is its strength. And that's a paradox you have to understand, because I can tell you, you can write 1,000 books on the imperfections of ASEAN, which is what every Anglo-Saxon media writer writes about ASEAN. If you read all the Anglo-Saxon writers, ASEAN should have collapsed. But it still keeps going. And I say it moves like a crab. It takes 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, 1 step sideways. And you watch ASEAN in slow motion, it seems to be going around in circles. But you slice it decade by decade, its GNP from 1970 to 1980 goes like this, 1980 to 1990 goes like this, 1990 to 2000 goes like this. And now ASEAN combined is the 7th largest economy in the world. And by 2050 will become the 4th largest economy in the world. You want a place, good place to invest? Try Southeast Asia. And that's amazing. One of the least likely places to succeed was always Southeast Asia, but it's moving ahead. And the important thing to understand is that clearly there's this hidden genius inside ASEAN, which I try to explain in the book. But let me conclude my third and very important point. It's important to emphasize that ASEAN was in many ways what you might call an American creation. Founded at the height of the Cold War, when the 5 ASEAN countries were frightened of being swamped by the Soviet Union and Chinese communism and so on and so forth. It was formed as a pro-American body. And during the Cold War, ASEAN and United States worked very well together. And that, I can tell you, built up links that are very deep and have remained over the years. But to put in a slightly uncomfortable point here, at the same time, America has been inconsistent in its policies towards ASEAN. It loved ASEAN during the Cold War, then found ASEAN a burden after the Cold War ended because ASEAN was no longer needed, then rediscovered ASEAN again after 9/11 happened in 2001, and they said, hey, maybe ASEAN can be useful again. Now that sort of inconsistency is unwise. So one of the key recommendations in the book is that America should develop a deep internal consensus on what to do with ASEAN. It should decide that ASEAN actually is a strong long-term asset for American interests, and therefore have a consistent policy. And consistency is just very simple things. You know, most countries in the world, including the great powers, annually when ASEAN has meetings, they turn up. But the most inconsistent participant is often the American Secretary of State. Why? Oh, a crisis broke out in Syria. There will always be crisis. The question is, how consistent are you? And one key thing to remember is that quite often in the Asian context, style and form is as important as substance. So just turning up makes a huge difference. So if America can do that and decide, hey, this is truly an important part of the world, we're going to make a 100-year bet on ASEAN, and for the next 100 years, turn up at every ASEAN meeting. So thank you very much. I look forward to my dialogue with Denny.
Well, thank you so much, Kishore. As always, tremendously provocative. I will say unexpectedly upbeat. You certainly have encouraged us greatly. It's an honor to be up here with you, Kishore. I think our connection began in the 90s when I worked for Tom Pickering, and you were the permanent secretary of Singapore, and then you were the permanent representative of Singapore. Your permanence is one of your most impressive features, and we're certainly glad to have you here today at the Asia Society.
Let me tell a quick story you should know. When my title was permanent secretary, when a colleague of mine, permanent secretary, went to China, he called his Chinese vice minister, who's his counterpart. He said, "I'm permanent secretary." The Chinese translator looked very puzzled and said, "This guy says he's the eternal typist from Singapore." Permanent secretary became eternal typist.
That should be the title of your memoir. I love that. Well, so you've always helped me to do something really important for any diplomat, which is to see myself and see my country more objectively. And I've borrowed your eyes and your perspective many times, and it wasn't always a happy experience because you have...
You're right. Today I've been quite nice.
Yes. I probably shouldn't tempt fate by pointing that out. But I choose to interpret your views as tough love, as a sign of your respect and affection for the United States and your high expectations that the U.S. can do well for the world. And I hope you agree that over the last 8 years, particularly with respect to ASEAN, that there has been a sustained focus. President Obama decided, after serious internal debate, not only to begin annual summits with the 10 leaders of ASEAN, but to join the East Asia Summit. And it's no small matter for the President of the United States to invest the time it takes to fly across the Pacific. And I can attest to the fact that ASEAN meetings can be a bit challenging. It's an acquired taste, but it's definitely...
We invented boredom.
I wouldn't say you invented it, but perhaps took it to a new level. I fully agree with you about the miraculous quality of ASEAN. And it struck me many times that a region of 650 million people with incredibly youthful demographics and growing, thriving set of economies, as you've pointed out, emerged from Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, so many different religious divides, so many ethnic divides, the divide of the maritime and the mainland countries, the democracies and the authoritarian governments, the big countries, the small ones, the wealthy, the poor, the rural, the urban. And on top of that, the grudges, the historical grudges that you mentioned. Not to mention the legacy of colonial borders that are still generating problems today. It really is a miracle. Why doesn't Southeast Asia look more like the Balkans? Why doesn't it look more like the Middle East? And I think your point is well taken that the United States has an interest in investing in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. But let me get to your point about consistency. I think certainly the Obama administration was consistent in its investment, and you saw the invitation by then President Obama to the 10 ASEAN leaders to come to Sunnylands, the Annenberg estate in California, for a 1.5-day intense retreat that generated something called the Sunnyland Principles, which were not something that the U.S. foisted on ASEAN, but really is an articulation of the things that we genuinely have in common. And we're seeing already that the Trump administration for all its many differences, has picked up where Obama left off. The president early on sent not only Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State Madison Tillerson to the region, but Vice President Pence. And when Vice President Pence was in Jakarta, he visited ASEAN headquarters. He announced that President Trump will, in fact, attend the East Asia Summit in Manila in November. This is really important. But what I heard again and again in Southeast Asia about consistency is not only that America shouldn't turn away from Southeast Asia, but that American engagement should be more than the Seventh Fleet. It shouldn't just be a military presence. It also has to be an economic engagement, and it has to be a political and a diplomatic engagement. So give us a sense, if you would, of how you think that is shaping up, and particularly what the impact of the withdrawal from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, might be on perceptions of American engagement and reliability.
Yeah. I think to answer your question, I have to bring in the biggest hidden elephant in the room. China. Because clearly what's changed everything is the return of China. And in the book, actually, one of the key messages, clearly what's going to happen is that I think in one way or another, US-China rivalry will rise. It may be contained, but it will rise. And in the process, the ASEAN countries are the most vulnerable to US-China competition. So you mentioned, for example, you're right, the United States should step up its economic engagement with ASEAN. But in the meantime, China was the first country out of the blue to propose a free trade agreement with ASEAN. And as a result of that, China-ASEAN trade in 1991 was $8 billion. By 2015, it was $400 billion. An increase of 50 times in 25 years. That clearly means that the Chinese magnet begins to work and begins to pull the ASEAN countries. And I can tell you that whatever they may say publicly and all that, clearly the ASEAN countries want to have an alternative. They also want to see a strong United States presence. But that's where your TPP question comes in. The TPP was so critical to make sure that American influence remained significantly entrenched in the region. At the end of the day, the economic competition is far more important than the military competition. So I think, frankly, that the United States' decision to walk away from the TPP, in a sense, you gave away the game. Because the net effect of this is that the Chinese economic factor is going to become much bigger. And by the way, Xi Jinping has announced publicly, and it may happen, that that China-ASEAN trade he wants to hit $1 trillion. And when you have $1 trillion of trade, I don't know what the exact figure is between US and ASEAN. It's something like 100 to 200 billion, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a huge gap then. And that's why there's a sense of urgency in this process. And at the same time, by the way, having brought in the China factor, one of the other big messages that I have in the book, and one of the key reasons why I wrote the book now, is to say to message to both Beijing and Washington DC, we know that both of you are going to increase your competition, but please don't use ASEAN as a factor in that competition. In fact, we actually say in our book, as you know, my book was co-authored with Jeffrey Sung. We say in the book, Beijing, Washington DC, please treat ASEAN as a Ming vase, as a delicate Ming vase. It's actually very precious. Because when you break it, It's very hard to put together. It's a very difficult thing to put together. It's a miracle that ASEAN stays together, but it does. So since it's there, make sure that we keep it going. So my advice to Washington, D.C. is be aware that China's influence is rising and find ways and means of also making sure that you remain as influential in the region.
Well, that's wise, Kishore. Now, the message that I frequently heard from Southeast Asian diplomats was along the lines that you suggest. We don't want to have to make a choice between the United States
and
or
China. Yeah.
China. And I think that's understandable. And the U.S. point of view is we have no interest in forcing countries in East Asia or Southeast Asia to make a choice, but we do want them to have the ability to make their own choices. So to what extent, from your point of view and from Southeast Asia's point of view, is the sustained U.S. military and economic presence a safeguard against coercion from China? A safeguard to ensure that this Ming vase doesn't get carted off to the National Museum in Beijing.
No, by the way, one thing that is going to happen, I mean, this is unstoppable, is what I call the return of 2,000 years of history. And the tremendous Chinese influence that used to be, and by the way, not just Chinese, I must emphasize, the first chapter of the book talks about the 4 waves of history. And what's significant is that even though the 10 Southeast Asian states are geographically closer to China, 9 out of the 10 Southeast Asian states, their cultural base is what they call Indian. And that's a very significant fact that people forget, you know. So the deep-rooted influences from India are a factor in Southeast Asia. So it's not just, China is not the only player in the region. India will become a key player too. I think Japan continues to play a role. So Southeast Asia will be subject to, will be, as you know, in the annual ASEAN meetings, they deal with many great powers at the same time. But in the case of the United States, the military presence is important, should continue. But I think a more critical part of the competition is, I would say, economic, social, and cultural. So, for example, one of the biggest assets you have in Southeast Asia is that most of the young Southeast Asians, if they decide which universities to go and study in, I think the figure is still much larger in the United States. If I'm not mistaken, about 50,000 Southeast Asian students come and study each year in American universities, and that's a huge asset that you have. And one reason also why ASEAN is at peace and why, and one thing you should know is that, you know, among the 10 ASEAN countries, you at least have 8 languages, but when they meet, they only speak in one. Unlike the European Union, you know, the 28 countries, when they meet, everything is translated into 21 languages. Yeah. All the 10 ASEAN countries only speak in one language. It's called English. Actually, it's more American. And that's because many of the ASEAN elites were actually trained in America and so on and so forth. So these are huge assets. So there are many other assets apart from the military assets. And I wouldn't just emphasize the military dimension.
Well, Kishore, you're very, very right to stress also the cultural and the people-to-people connection. And speaking personally, one of the things that I'm proudest of in my career is being actively associated with the initiative begun in the Obama administration that goes by the unwieldy acronym of YSEALI, Young Southeast Asia Leadership Initiative. But when you strip away that horrible acronym, what you have is a really wonderful program that has found young people in all 10 ASEAN countries who are engaged in a wide variety of community building activities, philanthropic, cooperative activities, and what the United States offered, in addition to harnessing the star power of Barack Obama, who would host these groups when they came to Washington once a year in the White House, and who would speak in a big town hall every time he visited an ASEAN country, which was at least once every year, was a network that allowed them to communicate with each other. And I often thought that the U.S., through that Young Southeast Asian Leaders Program, did more to create a sense of unity within and among ASEAN young people than, frankly, most of the leaders of the 10 ASEAN countries had done. So that was one very important point of connectivity. Another thing that I'm very proud of was being involved in the deliberations that culminated in the decision by President Obama to join the East Asia Summit. Now, you mentioned China and India, Japan, Korea. There's also Australia, New Zealand, Russia, and the United States. These are the 8 partner countries that come together at the leaders level on an annual basis, and will in mid-November in Manila, to engage on a range of important issues, including on security, including on addressing pandemics or other global problems, as well as on development. I don't know if this all fits in a Ming vase, but it was certainly my observation that for the United States and China, for Japan and India and Russia to come together as partners with ASEAN as the host creates a dynamic in which there is a bias towards cooperation, and that the ASEANs as chair who set the agenda can do a lot to mitigate friction points. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't do a little shout out to the
So this is what they call the commercial break.
product placement, to the ASPI report, Preserving the Long Peace in Asia, which contains some important recommendations about the future.
And I'm happy to endorse this report. I had a quick look at it, and it's got some very valuable suggestions. And I'm glad you also suggested that the EAS component in the ASEAN Secretariat be strengthened. I saw that's one of the recommendations. And in fact, one of the recommendations of our book is that more should be done to strengthen the ASEAN Secretariat, because it's one of the most underfunded institutions in the world. Now, just to give you a simple statistic, the combined GDP of the European Union, and I must emphasize, the European Union is still the #1 regional organization in the world, the most successful one. So the combined GDP of the ASEAN, of the European Union, is 6 times the size of the ASEAN countries. 6 times. Much bigger, but still 6 times. The budget of the European Secretariat, if you add everything up, is not 6 times larger, not 12 times, not 24 times, not 48 times. It's 8,000 times larger. Okay, maybe ASEAN should not be 8,000. Maybe it could be 1,000 of the European Union. So I think one thing you could do, actually, the Asia Society could do, is actually look for best practices of regional secretariats, figure out what works and what doesn't work. It's true, there's quite often regional secretaries get fat, bureaucratic, and bloated, and so on and so forth. But ASEAN is the exact opposite. ASEAN is the most lean and hungry secretariat in the world, you know. So something can be done to increase the budget of the ASEAN Secretariat. And one concrete recommendation we make in our book is forget the idea of equal payments, because then if you make it equal payments, Laos, which is clearly the country with the smallest GNP, pays the same amount as Indonesia, which has got $1 trillion economy almost. So that's unequal. So why don't we have a capacity to pay, which is principle that we have at the United Nations, and so on and so forth. So there are some simple things you can do to turn the switch to capacity to pay that will automatically increase the funding of the ASEAN Secretariat. And as the funding for the ASEAN Secretariat goes up, then these things that you mentioned in your report, getting ASEAN Secretariat to do more on East Asian Summit things can happen. But you need resources, you need space, you need everything. And that's something that the EAS can provide to the ASEAN Secretariat.
Well, my work here is done because I've gotten Ambassador Mahbubani to endorse this report. His work is done because he's just made a big fundraising pitch for the ASEAN Secretariat. I think that the decision by the United States to send a permanent representative to ASEAN headquarters in Jakarta was a very important step forward. And I'd also note that a lot of the good work that is being done, not only by ASEAN, but in the East Asia Summit context, is actually done by those ambassadors, by
That's right.
the perm reps themselves. So I think that's a contributor to strengthening the Secretariat. But one of the specific recommendations in the Asia Society Policy Institute report is that the East Asia Summit should engage further in addressing the hard issues, the strategic and the security issues. And I'll tell you that one of the battles, a tug of war that we experienced over the last 6+ years since the United States joined the East Asia Summit was a bias towards the soft issues. And particularly the Chinese and many of the ASEANs also just wanted to have a meeting that ran through an agenda, no surprises, nothing that required the bureaucrats to write contingency papers for their leaders, and a high level of comfort with the reading of prepared statements that didn't really move the ball forward. I think that the progression has been in the direction of tackling tough issues. The East Asia Summit spoke out on North Korea and the nuclear threat, spoke out on ISIL and violent extremism, spoke out on global warming and climate change. I'm not sure that will go over too well this year. Spoke out on some difficult issues, but where the East Asia Summit has had the most difficulty is on the real clear challenges that face the region from within. And I'm thinking, for example, specifically about the South China Sea. Do you think that there is, in fact, as this report recommends, room for the East Asia Summit to be able to wrap its arms and begin really dealing with the friction points among the 18 members?
Well, my reply is be careful. And I'll tell you why, because I mentioned to you all that ASEAN is the most imperfect organization in the world. It is. But what holds it together is this very sort of loose, informal culture. And the reason why ASEAN has outperformed virtually every other regional organization in the world, leaving aside the European Union, is because the Indonesians injected this ideas of musyawara and mufakat, consultation and consensus. And that's a very important thing. So it's a very slow process. You just keep talking. You keep talking. Okay, you may not agree. Let's wait. Let's take our time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to reach agreement each time or to arrive at a decision each time. But what happens is that in the process of talking and talking, you begin to understand each other better, each other's concerns. So even within the ASEAN family, there were some difficult issues. I'll give you an example. Myanmar, right? When Myanmar joined, you all know how much tension it caused, and in fact, United States criticized ASEAN for admitting Myanmar. The European Union cut off links with ASEAN because we admitted Myanmar. But one of the key messages of the book we make in our book is very simple. I said, listen, there were two countries in the world that had military regimes for a long time. One was taken care of by the West. One was taken care of by ASEAN. The country with a long-standing military regime that was taken care of by the West was Syria. How do you take care of that? You had sanctions, isolation, bombing, and so you see what happened in Syria. Myanmar, we did the opposite. We engaged Myanmar, we welcomed them into ASEAN, and we taught them the ASEAN way. And then you saw this amazing gradual transformation away from a military regime towards civilian rule in Myanmar. You know why it happened? Because the Myanmar military officials attended 1,000 ASEAN meetings a year. You talk about boredom. Wow. 1,000 ASEAN meetings, and every time they flew to an ASEAN capital, the Myanmar colonel, the Myanmar general would say, why is, Laos ahead of Myanmar? Why do they have better roads? Why do they have better hospitals? Why do they have better schools? They saw with their own eyes, their eyes open because they go around ASEAN. So that made a huge difference. And that's why they decided, okay. And in our book we tell two amazing stories. When Cyclone Nargis happened, right? Mm-hmm. Big crisis. Myanmar decided not to accept international assistance. And that point, unfortunately, was just after the 2005 UNGA resolution on humanitarian intervention. Bernard Kouchner, the French foreign minister, proudly announces, time for humanitarian intervention to Myanmar. What does the Burmese military do? They take their soldiers away from taking care of the Cyclone Nargis and they go and protect the border from a French intervention. It was a disaster. So what happened? The ASEAN countries, foreign ministers went to Myanmar and spoke to them and asked them a very simple question which we put in the book. How much does ASEAN matter to you? And Myanmar said, yes, ASEAN matters to us and let us help you. And that's how the international assistance to Nargis happened. So, all this slow process of talking and meeting, at the end of the day, a decade later, you see the results. And that's why the region, when I first attended ASEAN meetings in 1971, okay, I went my first ASEAN meeting, just 5 of us in the room, 5 countries. You could feel the suspicion and distrust in the room. You could cut it with a knife, the suspicion and distrust in the room. Then when I became permanent secretary, and then I was a senior official leader, and I went to ASEAN meetings 25 years later, amazing, everybody was so relaxed. The suspicion and distrust had gone away. Thousands of meetings, you build up human networks. And so one of the best things that ASEAN has done is created human networks all through Southeast Asia. And you have, of course, ASEAN meetings of education officials, ASEAN meetings of defense officials, ASEAN meetings of economic officials. But there's also an ASEAN committee of pediatric surgeons. Pediatric surgeons from 10 countries meeting together. Amazing. So you have all kinds of committees that are being created. And so don't downplay the slow process that is going on. And that slow process, I think, the advantage of making ASEAN central is that culture can then infect the rest of East Asia. Just imagine what Northeast Asia would have been like if 50 years ago they set up an ANIAN, an Association of Northeast Asian Nations. They didn't do so. You see the difference. Look at Northeast Asia, look at Southeast Asia. That's what ASEAN did.
Well, Kishore, with all due respect to talk therapy, and the very, very...
I obviously failed to convince you.
The very real and very significant effects that the ASEAN process has had on the 10 members. And I do pay real credit to the organization and its founders for that. Let me push back a little bit. What we see today in ASEAN, which is still bound by the same sort of principles of consensus and
non-interference,
the magical ASEAN way, remaining within the comfort zone of all 10 members and so on, gives rise to some doubt about whether that is a sharp enough tool to be effective in this stage of the 21st century. And when you look at recent experiences, the debacle of 2012, the Cambodian chairmanship, when the ASEAN ministers were unable to even issue a communique where Cambodia was really used as a kind of stick in the spokes to block consensus. And we've seen repetitions of that. Where we've seen, frankly, the walking back of ASEAN commitment to some basic principles in support of the rule of law, including a commitment as pertains to the maritime security issues, the South China Sea, commitment to diplomatic and legal processes, a commitment to some of the principles that were articulated by ASEAN in the past, and it's pretty clear why there has been that backsliding. Just 2 weeks ago here in New York, when the ASEAN foreign ministers met to discuss the very difficult issue of Rakhine State and the disruptive and frankly heartbreaking problem that faces now almost 500,000 displaced people and refugees, and particularly the Rohingya. The ministers couldn't agree on a joint statement. The chair issued a communique or statement with the sense of the ministers, and a bit later, Malaysia, one of the 10, I think perhaps unprecedentedly, renounced the consensus. So that's a tiny crack perhaps in the Ming vase. And we see some real setbacks to democratic institutions among the ASEAN countries, the unresolved coup in Thailand, the challenges that over corruption in Malaysia, problems in the Philippines, and so on. So to fulfill your ambition of convincing Americans of the tremendous worth, value, and opportunity that ASEAN offers, something I fully share, can you assure us, can you show us that ASEAN can really get its act together? Can ASEAN, notwithstanding a lot of hand-holding and kumbaya, make some of the tough decisions that the world requires now?
Answer is yes.
Good. Glad we cleared that up.
And you see, I was actually very happy that the 2012 debacle happened. 2012 debacle is when, for the first time by the way, one thing that ASEAN does every year is produces a long, boring joint communique which no one reads, But it's very important symbolically to produce that joint communique. And in 2012, for the first time in 45 years, ASEAN failed to produce one. I thought that was wonderful. It was a wake-up call for ASEAN. You see, US-China competition is coming, and we've got to handle it. So you mentioned, for example, South China Sea. Now, it's very interesting. 2-3 years ago, if you had opened up the newspaper, even the New York Times, you would find lots of stories about the South China Sea. When was the last time you saw a story on South China Sea now in the New York Times? Notice how it's gone quiet? Is that gone quiet by accident? Or has it gone quiet because there have been lots of dialogues taking place behind the scenes? So these dialogues, at the end of the day, if they help to reduce the temperature on a difficult issue, it makes a difference. But you raise another point. The other point is about the internal problems of various states. Now, certainly the Rohingya problem is a huge, difficult issue. But I thought that the column that Kevin Rudd wrote was a very good column, pointing out, hey, there's some internal political dynamics going on they've got to pay attention to
in Myanmar.
In Myanmar. So you've got to be sensitive to the internal political dynamics. And I do think it's actually very wise of the ASEAN countries not to get involved in other countries' internal disputes, because that can throw up a real Pandora's box. And so let's take Malaysia, for example. You mentioned about the problems that Malaysia is having. Now, it may come as a shock to many of you, but if you went through all the developing countries in the world, and you leave aside the four tigers, okay, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the country that has done the best in terms of economic development and in reducing its poverty from 50% to less than 1% is Malaysia. And if you want to have a good example of healthcare provision to low-income families, go to Malaysia. So there are all kinds of success stories in the development that people forget. You see all the surface stories of the difficulties and so on and so forth. But in terms of human development indicators, it's very hard to beat what the ASEAN countries have done. And at the end of the day, what is more important is the impact it has on the peoples of ASEAN's lives and how their lives are improving as a result of the ASEAN processes. Now, one of the amazing things, if you look at the, if you want to know a country that was at conflict for the longest time, clearly it was Vietnam, right? From Dien Bien Phu to, 1990, right? Over, 60, 70 years? War, right? Mm-hmm. And when Vietnam turned, Vietnam reduced poverty faster than any country did. And you want to know why it did so? Because it joined ASEAN. The ASEAN factor on impact on development is people completely not documented. In the book we give statistics, okay? You take Indonesia was known to be a country that's always in trouble, always having difficulties developing, right? Brazil, the great hope. We look at the chart in our book, the last 25 years. Guess who's grown faster? Indonesia or Brazil? Indonesia. Why? It joined ASEAN. So trust me, if you want to judge ASEAN, forget all the surface things. Look at what the people at the bottom are doing in societies and compare with ASEAN. And we beat everyone.
Well, does that suggest, Kishore, that you're in favor of opening the door to East Timor, Timor-Leste, to join ASEAN if it has that galvanic effect?
Yes.
Shouldn't you be a little more generous and inclusive?
Yes, and I think we would certainly, but at the same time, we have told the Timorese, please get ready. Have you got enough officials to send to 1,000 ASEAN meetings a year? Believe me, you don't want to crush Timor-Leste. We said yes, but we said get ready first.
Great. Well, I'm having a great time, and I shouldn't monopolize your insights and your wisdom. I have a few questions from folks online, but I think we also have some microphones, if I'm not mistaken. And if so, let's get them out, and I will call on folks and ask them some questions. John, are we going to be able? Oh, you're going to be able to offer a microphone? Okay. So, shall we begin with that gentleman right there?
Thank you. I'm Hugh Patrick, Columbia Business School. Kishore, what do you worry most about? You're very optimistic and positive. What do you really worry about most for ASEAN and for the world?
Oh, I must confess, I do have lots of worries. Now, my worry number one, and I said this already, that increasing US-China rivalry could break up ASEAN the next 10 years. That's my number one worry. And that's a very strong message in the book to both US and China. Please, whatever you do, don't use ASEAN as the focus of your rivalry. Try and keep ASEAN intact in that process. And then, of course, you do have internal challenges in all the ASEAN countries. In fact, we have one of the contributions our book does is to have a pen sketch of the 10 ASEAN countries. So if you want a quick pen sketches, and you will find that each one has got its own challenges. So Thailand, you mentioned, Thailand is going to have a very difficult time making this transition from this military rule back to civilian rule. It's a very complicated political process involving lots of actors. So that's a big challenge. So there are challenges. I mean, ASEAN hasn't hit nirvana, but at the same time, the presence of ASEAN creates a kind of a peaceful ecosystem that enables these problems to be dealt with, and that you don't have to worry about them going to war and so on and so forth. So I mean, the biggest contribution, by the way, that ASEAN has made is that it's taken one of the most divided regions on planet Earth. It's called the Balkans of Asia, by the way, Southeast Asia, and made it peaceful. And that's an amazing accomplishment.
Kishore, we have a few questions online about ASEAN and Islam. You've got three Muslim majority countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. You have numerous other countries, including Singapore, with very significant Muslim populations. At the same time, Southeast Asia is experiencing in Marawi, in the southern Mindanao, southern Philippines, and knock on wood, God forbid, someday perhaps through Bangladesh in Myanmar and in Rakhine State, the threat from returning fighters from ISIL-inspired ideologies. You had bombings in Jakarta and elsewhere. Singapore has been under threat. And then you have things like the perceived Muslim ban on the part of the United States. Could you talk a little bit about how this creature, ASEAN, which has so many of the healing capacities that you've described, is dealing with the Muslim factor?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's a key factor, and I know it is a fact. In the West, there's a lot of pessimism about the Islamic world. I mean, it's a fact. You can read the papers every day. But if you're looking for one part of the world where the Muslim populations are doing very well, where the economy is growing at 5 to 6% a year, that's in Southeast Asia, Indonesia and Malaysia. So we actually say in the book that, for example, as you know, Europe is very worried about North Africa. You know, what's going to happen in Libya, in Tunisia and Algeria is going to impact on Europe. So we actually say that if you want to find models for development for North Africa, come to Southeast Asia. Because there are, of course, I must emphasize, we are all imperfect societies and there will be challenges. But you know, we make a big deal out of Marawi. Marawi was partly, by the way, an international issue, but also a very domestic issue. You know, there's this domestic militias and all that, and there's a fallout within them. So that's also part of the factor. But I had absolutely no doubt that they will be crushed, because the Philippine state is a relatively strong state. At the end of the day, they will crush Marawi. It may take some time, but they would do it. And you know, you remember in Jakarta, right? The hotels used to get terrorist bombs, right? Now, guess what? The bombing has stopped. So one of the good news about Southeast Asia is that the intelligence organizations have actually developed their capabilities quite well, and are now, thanks to ASEAN, exchanging information quite well. And that's why, touch wood, relatively speaking, Southeast Asia has been spared a lot of terrorist incidents. So the cooperation and dealing with each other, exchanging information, has helped to curb ISIS and ISIL. And you know, we've caught lots of people before they could do anything. That's through regional collaboration.
Great. Let me open the floor up again. Yes, there's a lady in the red jacket.
Kishore, thank you for your wisdom, which we all count upon. You began with a major problem, and that is what has happened to TPP. So you're a problem solver. How can the Pacific countries cooperate with each other despite not having the formal treaty, and particularly how can the U.S. strengthen its role and cooperation with Asian countries?
And I'm sorry, could you identify yourself to the
With
group?
pleasure. Susan Geraldson, International Consultants.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for your question, Susan. I think, the important thing to remember about the TPP is that even though the United States has walked away from the TPP, the 11 other members have not. In fact, the 11 other members are still trying to make it work and still hoping that the United States will change its mind. So, that's a very powerful signal. They could have said, okay, game over, let's close shop. That would have been one response. Would have been a rational response. Okay, United States not interested. Forget it. Move on. No. We're still going to keep TPP going. We're going to keep the door open. And we want the United States to come back at some point in time. So that's a very important signal that the region is sending. And I think at the end of the day, hopefully, I know, by the way, I read the newspapers. I know that free trade is now toxic in the American political system. I know that. But at some point in time, if someone does some rational economic calculations, it will show that the world's largest new markets are emerging in East Asia. The figures I gave about middle class from 1.8 to 3.2 to 4.9, you won't be surprised to hear that most of them are going to be Asians, right? You want markets. That's where they are. So at some point in time, if the United States does a very careful, rational calculation of its long-term economic interests, it will realize it is actually in America's interest to go back to TPP.
Well, I think, Kishore, it's fair to say that U.S. businesses have made that rational
You're right. Absolutely
analysis, and that is why the United States is the largest investor, largest source of foreign direct investment in ASEAN.
I agree.
I think that's maybe the fourth largest destination for U.S. overseas.
And that's very important. Very important.
Let me open the floor again. Yes, sir. Please.
John Allen, Greater China Corporation. And Kishore, loved your talk as usual, but your tough love message to basically the U.S. right now regarding the elephant in the room is very similar to what Lee Kuan Yew said a few years ago about Japan. He said, remember, the Japanese are equally good warriors as they are as businessmen. So let's keep them as businessmen. And it sounds like China is taking that tack with the rest of the world, whereas the U.S. is beginning to shake its stick. And the question I want to relate to, though, is, and you mentioned in your book, is as China expands its emphasis and influence around the world, the One Belt, One Road program will make an enormous additional difference in terms of the U.S.'s ability to do business and have influence in the world. I'd like your comments on that.
Yeah, actually, I'm very, very glad, John, that you raised the Belt and Road Initiative, because if you really want to know what is going to change the world in the next 10 to 20 years, I would say the Belt and Road Initiative is going to change the world. And I think, because for a very simple reason, you have a marriage of demand and supply. The biggest demand for infrastructure in the world is in Asia. It's something like $3 or $4 trillion of infrastructure needs to be built in Asia. You need someone who can provide the resources to do that. And the Chinese happen to have a lot of money, which they discovered parking in US Treasury bills doesn't give them good enough returns, and also they discovered more critically after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, it doesn't give them leverage. So they're going to take their money out and park it and use it somewhere else where it is needed. So from the Chinese point of view, the Belt and Road Initiative is amazing because it opens doors for them in countries everywhere. If let's say, as you know, there was a competition between Japan and China to build the Bandung-Jakarta railway. And up to the 11th hour, it was Japan's. And the Japanese were very surprised on the 12th hour when it turned to Chinese. But by the way, that kind of competition is very good for the region, okay? If somebody comes to you and says, I'll build your train cheaper, better, faster, you take it. That's what the Chinese are going to do. They're going to build cheaper, better, faster trains and so on and so forth. So the Belt and Road Initiative is going to have an enormous impact, on many countries. And I think one of the things that is hugely underestimated by the world is the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, it's certainly something that the world is looking at very closely, and I know that not only U.S. policymakers, but particularly U.S. companies are looking to see what sort of opportunities will emerge, to what extent will Belt and Road projects be open to foreign suppliers, to foreign services, etc. Now, your Prime Minister was conspicuously not invited to the Belt and Road Party that Xi Jinping hosted. There are other examples of Beijing manifesting its displeasure over political statements or lack of accommodation by neighbors. You, Kishore, famously got a fair amount of flack from your friends and colleagues over an article that you wrote about big lessons for little countries and making something out of the Qatar example, asking some questions about that. Look, China is so big, and China has so many carrots and so many sticks that it poses a question not only for ASEAN and not only for the neighboring countries, but for others as well, which is, what is the right strategy? What is the right balance? Everybody wants to do business with China. Everybody wants to see China stable and growing, but nobody wants to kowtow. So where do you steer that ship?
Yeah, well, one important point of fact, Singapore was invited to the Belt and Road Initiative Summit. And I can tell you that when Minister Shanmugam, our Minister of Home Affairs, came actually to the Lee Kuan Yew School to give a talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, a speech which I highly commend to you because he did a lot of research in that speech. He gave a statistic which actually surprised me. I hadn't heard it. You know, the Chinese are welcoming both incoming investment as well as outgoing investment for the Belt and Road Initiative, right? 85% of incoming BRI investment into China goes through Singapore. 33% of outgoing BRI investment goes through Singapore. So the country that is the most integrated with the Belt and Road Initiative is Singapore. So Singapore actually is going to become, and you know, when people, a lot of the news stories about the Belt and Road Initiative, as you know, talk about the revival of the Silk Road. So you think of the camels going across the desert and the Silk Road coming back again. Most of the trade for the Belt and Road Initiative is not going to go through Central Asia. China's trade with Central Asia is much smaller than China's trade with Southeast Asia. And so a lot of the actual economic flows through the BRI will go through Southeast Asia and go through Singapore. So we're going to become a major beneficiary. But you're right, how do you maintain this balance? And there's a learning process going on. Every country is learning how to manage the new China. And trust me, when any country becomes powerful, it will become more assertive. You cannot stop it. The only question is whether China will become aggressive. And I actually maintain that China will become assertive, but not necessarily aggressive. And that, frankly, the region will have to live with.
Thank you. Okay, the questions from the floor. Yes, this gentleman over here, please.
John McAuliffe from the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. A great pleasure. Could you give us a sense of where ASEAN opinion, or at least leadership opinion, is about our president at this point? Particularly how Senator Corker's statements raising very deep questions about capacity, how that's affecting opinion in Southeast Asia, and in a sense, if you were assuming anybody would listen in the White House, if you could give advice as to how the president could have a positive effect when he goes, what would your advice be?
And I would just like to make clear that not being an ASEAN member, the United States does not have a non-interference policy, so you can speak freely.
No, I'll speak freely, and I'll tell you that the United States is very important to every Southeast Asian country. At the same time, we have no say in the selection of the American president. The American president is chosen by the American people. And so we have to live with your choice. And at the end of the day, we must maintain good relations with the United States. Believe me, no country in Southeast Asia wants bad relations with the United States. So you have to, if you want to go and talk to the White House, or you want to discuss American policy, you have to talk to President Trump. So we accept your decision, and we have to live with it. So so we will actually carry forward the ASEAN policy of non-interference in each other's internal affairs towards America also. We will not interfere in your internal affairs.
But let me ask you to address the second half of the question, namely, what kind of actions, what kind of messages do you think, or would you advocate that President Trump convey to the region, including in his upcoming travel?
I think the most important thing, by the way, I emphasize to you all, right? Style and form is so important. Showing up is so important. Now you confirmed that publicly what President Trump has said, he's coming to Manila. Unfortunately, there are now very strong rumors. I don't know if you heard them. There are very strong rumors he's only going to go to Korea and Japan and not to Vietnam and the Philippines. And I think that would be a mistake, because it's important for an American president to turn up in ASEAN capitals. So believe me, I think if he comes, he'll be hugely appreciated. Because, you know, symbolically, I know symbolism doesn't seem to matter too much in American eyes, but in Asian eyes, symbolism matters a lot. So when an American president turns up, it has a huge impact. And sometimes when he can't turn up for good reasons, as you know, President Obama, I think, had to cancel 3 trips to Southeast Asia, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, you know, these were beyond his control. The events happened, but it has a huge impact nonetheless. I was in Bali at that APEC meeting when President Obama couldn't turn up. And I can tell you that the person who stole the show at that ASEAN meeting was Xi Jinping. His address became by far the most important address of the result. So turning up is actually very, very important. So I would say that if President Trump turns up in the Philippines and turns up in Vietnam, that's very important for us in terms of signaling and in maintaining an American presence.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's tremendously important for the United States, from the president on down, to be present and accounted for in the region and in these meetings. Now, at East Asia Summit meetings, the fact is that Xi Jinping has never gone. It's always been the premier, Wen Jiabao or Li Keqiang, who goes to the actual East Asia Summit. And Vladimir Putin has never been to an East Asia Summit either. He's always sent Sergei Lavrov, his foreign minister. So When it comes to the East Asia Summit itself, I think the United States has a good record.
Which I hope it keeps, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you and me both. We have time for one more question, I think. And yes, this gentleman over here.
My name is Peter Fishbein. I'm an international lawyer. I have heard periodically at lectures at the Asia Society economists making the point that the Chinese economy is not sustainable, and with the political system there's a real risk that China will implode. So my question is, should people like you and ASEAN and others be worrying about how to manage China's fall rather than only manage China's rise?
Well, I'm actually acutely aware that the balance of sentiment among China watchers in America is that China in one way or another will not succeed, that China will implode, China will have a hard landing, Chinese Communist Party will break apart. And of course any of these things can happen, and I don't rule out the possibility. But believe me, if China falls apart, it is not a problem for America. But if the opposite happens, and if China continues to perform well, continues to grow, maybe not 9%, maybe not 7%, maybe 5 to 6% easily for the next 20 to 30 years, you're going to have a China that in PPP terms, by the way, is already bigger than United States of America, will be twice the size of America. And you know something? It is conceivable. It can happen. And I ask you to look at only one chart. If you want to see the future, there's a chart that someone sent to me. Research and development expenditures over the last 30 years. Okay? Japan, constant. European Union, constant. United States, constant for the last 30 years. China, which used to be below Japan, has shot up, is almost reaching US R&D expenditures, and is going to shoot beyond that. And all this, they're producing the world's fastest computers, the world's best fast trains. Try them out. And amazingly enough, this is what's shocking about China, in terms of economic innovation. You know, Singaporeans look as though we are third world. When you go to China, we keep producing cash. The Chinese say, what do you mean cash? Bung, chung, 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 chung. Everything is paid for. Put your feet back. What is cash? You know, their mobile payment system is the best in the world. In a closed political system, is producing such dramatic innovations. So my suggestion to you is, it's safer to overestimate what China may do than to underestimate what China may do, and then work out the consequences. It's a different world that's coming.
Well, Kishore, you've been remarkably positive, insightful as always. I will take brief exception with one thing you said, which is, if I heard you right, that if China were to collapse, to come unglued, that it wouldn't affect the United States.
It'd be a smaller problem.
No, I think that is an immense problem. And I've heard President Obama say in the past that he had no anxiety about a strong China. He had great anxiety about an unstable China, and I think it's very much in all of our interests.
And I believe it won't happen.
Yeah, not only to see a strong and stable China, but a strong and stable ASEAN as well.
So, I think we're going to have to come back to continue this debate because we just started getting very interesting here about the future. Please join me in thanking Danny Russel and Ambassador Mahbubani and for an excellent program. There are books in the back, and are you going to sign?
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that
I'm gonna
okay?
sign the
So don't miss the opportunity. There's, I think, 5 of the books. I want to thank. We came together tonight thanks to Delta Airlines, so thank you. I know they have someone here. I also want to just give a special shout out to Ambassador Al-Malami from Saudi Arabia. So Asia Society traditionally had defined Asia up to Iran. And this bothered all of our friends in Asia who were west of Iran. And so we've corrected that with a vote of the board 2 years ago to include the Rand McNally, or the UN definition of Asia, which includes the Gulf and Asiatic Turkey to Asiatic Russia. And we've done our first trustee trip to visit with the leadership of Saudi Arabia and UAE and Oman. And on November 1, we will elect to our board the first Saudi Arabia representative on our trustees. So thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and great to have you here. So enjoy yourself at the book signing, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Josette.